Let's begin with something fundamental yet disturbingly overlooked: the human proclivity to turn reverence into worship and worship into idolatry. It's a subtle psychological movement, often cloaked in tradition and affection. But beneath that veil lies something potent and dangerous, a betrayal of the sacred hierarchy between the creature and the Creator. When the veneration of Mary begins to overshadow the worship of Christ, we are no longer in the realm of theological nuance. We're witnessing a psychological collapse into idolatry, a collapse with historical precedent and devastating consequences. The human psyche is wired for hierarchy. This is one of the most essential insights of psychological science and religious anthropology. We orient ourselves by what we revere. That which we elevate to the highest position in our mental and emotional world becomes our functional God. And when that object is no longer transcendent, when it's no longer the absolute logos, the living word, the divine order, then that object, no matter how good or noble, becomes a tyrant disguised as a comforter. Now consider this: the maternal archetype, which Mary so profoundly embodies, is one of the most powerful psychological symbols in the human experience. She is the symbol of compassion, protection, and unconditional acceptance, and rightly so. But that archetype, when unrestrained, doesn't just nurture, it consumes. The mother who never lets go, the comfort that never challenges, the softness that never confronts, that archetype in its excess becomes psychologically pathological. It infantilizes, it disables growth, it paralyzes the soul. In healthy religious practice, Mary's image serves a profound purpose, pointing us to the mystery of incarnation, to the obedience of the humble, to the power of saying yes to God. But when the church crosses the line from veneration to near divinization, when the Pope begins attributing to her roles and honors that obscure the unique mediating role of Christ himself, it is no longer about honoring the mother of Jesus. It's about replacing the king with a queen mother and expecting her to do what he alone was meant to do. This is not just a theological error, it's a psychological one. Because what you elevate, you emulate. And when you emulate something that demands nothing from you, something that nurtures you endlessly, comforts you without confrontation, and shelters you from responsibility, you lose the very essence of what it means to mature. You regress. You see, worship changes you. It transforms you into the image of what you adore. If you worship the crucified Christ, you are called into suffering, transformation, death to self, and resurrection. That's terrifying, that's demanding, that's real. But if you worship Mary, or rather a distorted image of her, as an all-merciful, all-giving maternal figure, you are called into safety, protection, and sentimentality. That's a much easier path, but it's also a false one. It doesn't lead to God, it leads to dependency, emotional dependency masked as piety. And this is precisely where the church, under the weight of its own fear and cultural pressure, has perhaps crossed a line. In trying to make faith more accessible, more emotionally resonant, more compassionate, it has risked replacing the fire of holiness with the warmth of emotionalism. But make no mistake, emotionalism is not the same as truth. Sentiment is not the same as righteousness. And comfort is not the same as salvation. Historically, we've seen this play out before. When Israel worshiped the golden calf, they weren't worshiping Baal. They were attempting to worship Yahweh through a familiar image, something tangible, maternal, and manageable. But God was not amused. He was furious. Because any attempt to localize, to contain, or to soften the infinite reality of the divine is an act of rebellion disguised as reverence. So let's not pretend this doesn't matter. It matters immensely. The church is not just a community of people. It's a psychological and spiritual ecosystem. What it teaches, what it elevates, what it proclaims, it becomes, and its people become it. When the church elevates a figure, no matter how noble, to a status that rivals or obscures Christ, it is no longer serving God, it is serving itself. And that's not reverence, that's rebellion. Now many will say, but we're not worshiping Mary, we're just honoring her. That's not an argument. That's a rationalization. Because the line between honor and worship is not drawn by what you say, it's drawn by what you do, by what you pray, by where your heart leans when it is afraid, broken, and desperate. If in those moments your soul flees to Mary instead of Christ, you've already crossed the line. This isn't about condemnation. This is about clarity. It's about telling the truth, not to destroy, but to realign. Because when you get your worship wrong, everything else collapses. Your courage weakens. Your integrity erodes. Your ability to confront suffering diminishes. You become emotionally addicted to the symbol of mercy rather than committed to the reality of grace. So the question remains, what are we actually worshiping? What is our soul bowing to? And are we willing to tear down the false comforts, the sacred idols, and the theological illusions that keep us from bowing before the one true God? Because when you stop worshiping the truth and start worshiping your comfort, you don't grow, you decay. Let's talk about truth. Real, inconvenient, immovable truth. The kind of truth that doesn't bend to our feelings or our traditions. The kind that stands unmoved like a mountain in a storm. You see, in a time when everything is up for negotiation, when sacred symbols are remade in our image, and when the church itself struggles to define its boundaries, we have to confront this pressing question. What happens when the truth becomes offensive to the very institution that was meant to uphold it? What happens when the truth is no longer declared but dressed up, softened, and made marketable? This is where the discussion surrounding Mary, and specifically the Pope's increasingly exalted language about her, reveals a deeper crisis. We're not just dealing with a theological misstep. We're dealing with a fracture in the foundation of how we handle truth. And make no mistake, this fracture is not limited to the Catholic Church. It's a pattern we see everywhere, where truth becomes secondary to emotional comfort, institutional loyalty, or cultural sensitivity. Now let's analyze this psychologically. At the heart of every human being is a battle between truth and comfort. Freud saw this in the way people repress uncomfortable realities to maintain internal equilibrium. Jung saw it in the shadow, the parts of ourselves we deny because they're too hard to face. Peterson's own body of work continually brings us back to this central point. Truth is the pathway to transformation, but it often comes at the cost of safety and sentiment. So what happens when the church, which should be the guardian of truth, begins to twist it in order to soothe its followers or preserve its own structure? It ceases to be a place of transformation and becomes a place of sedation. And sedation, though it may look peaceful, is death disguised as calm. If you pay close attention to the language being used about Mary today, language that attributes to her roles that biblically belong solely to Christ, you start to notice something subtle but deeply disturbing. We are witnessing the redefinition of spiritual categories. Mary is no longer just the humble servant who magnifies the Lord. She is, in many cases, spoken of as a co-redemptrix, a mediatrix of all graces. That is not a minor embellishment. That's a theological hijacking. And you might say, well, what's the harm? It helps people connect emotionally. It honors her role as the mother of Jesus. But here's the issue. Truth is not determined by its emotional appeal. That's precisely what leads individuals and institutions into idolatry, into myth, into the comfort of a narrative that serves our emotional needs but blinds us to spiritual reality. The moment we begin to reshape truth to suit our need for security, we're no longer serving the logos, the divine order, the logic of God. We're serving our neurosis. And that is a betrayal not just of Scripture, but of the psychological structure required to live a meaningful life. When Christ said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," he didn't offer an optional framework. He issued an exclusive claim, and that exclusivity is offensive. It always has been, but it's also liberating because it calls you out of your false attachments. It burns away your illusions. It demands that you sacrifice your idols, not because God is cruel, but because you can't walk into freedom carrying chains disguised as religious ornaments. The church, if it wants to remain psychologically honest and spiritually alive, must reject the temptation to elevate human figures into divine roles. It must be willing to offend its own comfort. And this is hard because institutions, like individuals, are allergic to discomfort. They want to grow, but they don't want to change. They want influence, but not the cost of honesty. They want to be liked, but not rejected. But the truth is, you cannot follow Christ and avoid rejection, not from the world and not from parts of yourself that still cling to falsehood. If you tell the truth, especially within a sacred system that has grown too comfortable with its own mythology, you will be labeled divisive, dangerous, perhaps even heretical. But that is precisely the cost of discipleship. Christ wasn't crucified for being polite. He was crucified for speaking truth to power, for cutting through tradition when tradition had become a substitute for the living God. So if the Pope or any religious leader elevates Mary to a status that dilutes the uniqueness of Christ, then it is the duty of every believer to ask, is this truth or is this nostalgia dressed in sacred robes? We need to wake up to the psychological cost of these deviations. Every time truth is traded for sentiment, the individual becomes weaker. Every time authority bends Scripture to maintain favor, the soul becomes more dependent on illusion. And every time a culture worships comfort over clarity, decay sets in beneath the surface, even if everything looks peaceful on the outside. And so the challenge before us is this: will we choose truth even when it wounds our tradition? Will we speak clearly even when it makes us enemies? Will we follow Christ even if it means saying no to the most sacred idols of our institutions? Because the truth doesn't change to make us feel better. It changes us so we can become better. And here's the line I want you to leave with. Let's step back and think deeply about something that often escapes the average person's attention: the symbolic structure of reality. You see, human beings don't live by facts alone. We live by meaning. And meaning is carried in symbols. That's how cultures survive. That's how religions shape civilization. They embed their deepest truths inside rituals, inside sacred names, and inside the hierarchical ordering of those names. Now, when you tamper with those symbols, especially without understanding their origin, you don't just change theology. You destabilize an entire psychological framework. This brings us to the veneration of Mary and the shifting emphasis that's occurred, particularly in modern Catholicism. If Mary begins to take on attributes that properly belong to Christ alone, such as being called the mediatrix of all graces, or the Queen of Heaven in a divine sense, we're not simply dealing with poetic language. We're witnessing the inflation of a symbol, which, if left unchecked, will begin to dominate the collective psyche of the faithful. And that has enormous consequences. Carl Jung understood this kind of inflation as a psychological disorder. When a symbol exceeds its proper role, it takes on the power of the unconscious. It becomes archetypal in the wrong way. It begins to devour meaning rather than illuminate it. Think about that. It devours meaning. Instead of pointing upward toward the transcendent, it begins to pull people into projection, fantasy, dependency. It confuses emotional resonance with truth. And that confusion is dangerous. It's seductive. Because it feels good. It feels like devotion. But psychologically, it weakens the individual's capacity for discernment, for responsibility, and ultimately for freedom. Let's not forget, the Christian story is predicated on one mediator. That's not a harsh idea. It's a focused one. It doesn't mean Mary is irrelevant, quite the opposite. It means her greatness is precisely found in her submission to God, not in her elevation alongside him. The humility of Mary is her glory. The surrender of Mary is her strength. But when we begin to blur the lines between veneration and worship, when the language used for Mary begins to mirror the language used for Christ, we're not just honoring her, we're altering the entire symbolic landscape. And we are doing so at the expense of clarity, at the expense of psychological order, and at the expense of scriptural integrity. And this is not merely a doctrinal dispute, it's a battle over orientation. The human soul is always oriented towards something. It seeks an ultimate referent, a highest good, a north star. And if that referent is diffused, if it becomes shared or sentimentalized or politicized, then the soul loses its compass. The hierarchy collapses. Because everything can't be at the top. That's not order. That's chaos dressed up as inclusivity. When the Pope or other religious authorities begin to elevate Mary to a near equality status with Christ, the practical consequence is not more devotion, it's more confusion. And confusion breeds dependence. Dependence breeds passivity. And passivity, especially spiritual passivity, is a breeding ground for manipulation. So this isn't about hating Mary. This is about defending the integrity of what she stood for. She didn't say, look to me. She said, do whatever he tells you. Her life pointed to Christ. Her story magnifies his glory. If you truly love Mary, you should honor the role she chose. Servant, mother, vessel. Not reassign her into a role she never claimed for herself. Now imagine what this does to young minds growing up in a system where Mary is not just respected, but functionally worshipped. Now, just ask how the world would be, how safe and secure anyone would be if Mary is not just respected, but functionally worshipped. They begin to associate the maternal archetype not with support, but with salvation, not with love, but with lordship. That warps something deep in the psyche. It reverses the hierarchy of sacred roles and replaces the vertical structure, God above, man below, with something horizontal and confused. And when the vertical is lost, the transcendent becomes inaccessible. God becomes vague. Christ becomes optional. And Mary becomes central. It's not her fault. She's not asking for that. It's what we project onto her. And projection, when it comes to sacred figures, always tells us more about the culture than it does about the person being projected on. So here's where we are. The symbolic inflation of Mary threatens the stability of Christian theology, not because she's unimportant, but because she's being placed where she was never meant to be. And in doing that, we trade clarity for comfort, hierarchy for harmony, and truth for tradition. But the soul cannot grow in comfort. It grows in clarity. It grows in responsibility. It grows when it's faced with truth, even if that truth is inconvenient, even if it cuts against centuries of tradition. The church must recover its symbolic integrity, not out of disrespect for Mary, but out of reverence for the order that gives everything its rightful place. Christ alone is the center. Everything else must revolve around him, not alongside him, not in competition with him, but in submission to him. Let's consider something fundamental, something so easy to overlook, yet so foundational to how a society functions. When spiritual authority becomes entangled with the need for affirmation, it ceases to be an authority and becomes a performance. And that, I think, is what we're beginning to see in the modern church's relationship with figures like Mary. There's been a shift, not just in language, but in psychological posture, a softening of hierarchy into sentiment, a spiritual theater playing out under the guise of reverence. And it's not just bad theology, it's psychological misdirection. You have to ask yourself, why is Mary being exalted to such a degree that her image now often eclipses the image of Christ himself? That's not a matter of piety anymore. That's a redirection of worship. And here's the danger. When you begin to center spiritual energy on an image that wasn't meant to bear that weight, you create an idol, even if you never call it one. You distort the sacred architecture of the soul. And the cost of that distortion is immense. Think about the structure of meaning in a religious system. It depends on differentiation, on the precision of roles. God is not man. Christ is not Mary. Mary is not the church. These distinctions matter. They hold the symbolic scaffolding of belief together. If you collapse them into one emotional blur, mother, mediator, protector, queen, you make everything feel sacred, but you make nothing actually sacred. Because the sacred is defined by separation. It's not found in what you blend, it's found in what you set apart. That's what holiness means, to be set apart. You're not set apart. You're set apart. And when we try to democratize the sacred, when we try to make everything feel comforting and accessible, we often end up destroying the very thing we were trying to honor. You don't elevate Mary by confusing her role with Christ's. You obscure her. You turn her into a tool for spiritual consolation instead of a model for humility and surrender. And worse, you create a culture that begins to seek salvation not through discipline and sacrifice, but through sentiment and imagery. And here's where it gets dangerous. When leaders, especially someone as symbolically potent as the Pope, start playing into that emotional need, using Marian devotion as a kind of spiritual marketing, they compromise their role as guardians of doctrine. They become curators of comfort. And the church starts to lose its teeth. It stops telling the truth and starts telling people what they want to hear. But real spiritual growth, real psychological maturity, doesn't come from comfort. It comes from confrontation, from being told the truth, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Because pain is not the enemy, chaos is the enemy. And pain, when it's rightly ordered, when it's carried voluntarily, is the path through chaos. Mary understood that. That's why her story is powerful. Not because she was perfect, not because she was worshipped, but because she submitted to something greater. She bore her suffering. She stood at the foot of the cross, not on a throne. And the moment we forget that, when we start dressing her in crowns and imagining her co-equal with the Son of God, we are no longer honoring her. We're projecting our fear of pain, our longing for maternal comfort, our avoidance of the hard edge of truth. This is not a feminist critique. It's not an anti-Catholic rant. It's a call to psychological sobriety, to theological clarity. If the church is to remain strong, if it is to lead in a time of spiritual confusion and narcissistic indulgence, it must resist the temptation to trade authority for affirmation. It must preserve the distinctiveness of its symbols. And it must remember that not all devotion is healthy. Some forms of devotion are disguised dependence, their fear masquerading as piety. So the question isn't, should we honor Mary? Of course we should. The question is, what does true honor look like? And if your answer involves language that starts to replace Christ or distract from him or supplement his unique role as mediator, then you're not honoring Mary. You're misusing her. You're using her to fill a psychological void that only Christ is meant to fill. And let's be honest, this is what happens when religion tries to become therapeutic. When it bends toward the feelings of the congregation instead of the commands of Scripture. It loses the very power that once made it transformative. Because the truth isn't soft. It's not safe. But it sets you free. And anything that distracts from that, no matter how sacred it looks, is part of the problem. So I leave you with this. Let's talk about the core of the Christian message. Because if we don't have clarity there, everything else unravels. The cross, that's the center. The crucifixion of Christ, the suffering Son, willingly bearing the weight of sin and death on behalf of all humanity. There is nothing in Christian theology more central, more powerful, more disturbing, and more transformative than that symbol. It is the axis of meaning. Everything else, grace, forgiveness, identity, morality, flows from that single moment in time. So when the church begins to shift its emphasis, whether deliberately or subtly, from the cross to other figures, even revered ones like Mary, we're not dealing with harmless tradition or cultural variation. We're dealing with a fundamental misalignment, a distortion of priorities. And that has consequences not just for theology, but for the psyche, for how individuals understand suffering, salvation, and their own moral responsibility. Now, there's no denying that Mary plays a profound role in the story. She models humility, obedience, and maternal courage. But let's be precise. Her role is derivative, not foundational. It points to Christ. She bears the Messiah. She witnesses the sacrifice. She suffers, yes, but she does not save. And we must be careful, because once you start building doctrine or devotion around someone other than Christ, once you start displacing the central image of the cross with a secondary figure, you're not expanding the faith, you're fragmenting it. And here's the deeper problem. Psychologically, people are drawn to what soothes them more than what challenges them. That's human nature. The cross is brutal. It demands confrontation with your own darkness, with sacrifice, with moral accountability. But Mary, as she's often portrayed, is comforting, gentle, maternal. And so the temptation is to soften the edges of the faith by elevating her above her station, not intentionally, but functionally. Devotion becomes a way of bypassing the hard path Christ laid out. You start to see prayers not ending with "Thy will be done," but with emotional appeals to Mary as if she has some separate influence, some greater compassion. That's not biblical. That's projection. That's transferring our fear of the Father and our resistance to Christ's demands onto a more psychologically palatable figure. It's spiritual regression dressed up in reverence. And that's what makes it dangerous. Because it feels holy. It feels loving. It feels right. But it's not built on the truth, it's built on sentiment, on the psychological need for comfort over transformation. And the church should be the last institution to encourage that kind of self-deception. You know, one of the most tragic things I see in modern culture is the avoidance of suffering at all costs. People are medicating, distracting, numbing themselves because they cannot tolerate the burden of existence. And what Christianity offered, what made it revolutionary, was a framework that didn't eliminate suffering, but gave it meaning. It said, take up your cross voluntarily, not because life is easy, but because only through that burden can you become something more, can you be redeemed. And when we lose that, when we start substituting that framework with something less demanding, we lose the core mechanism of spiritual growth. We turn salvation into sentiment. We turn grace into indulgence. We start thinking that God exists to comfort us rather than to transform us. That's the real cost of over-exalting Mary. It's not just a theological issue, it's a psychological one. You train people to reach for comfort instead of courage, to pray to someone who won't confront their sin, who won't ask them to suffer for the sake of righteousness. And when you do that long enough, you don't just get weak Christians, you get a weak church, a hollow institution, preaching love without justice, hope without sacrifice. This isn't an attack on Catholicism. It's not even about denominational lines. It's about preserving the integrity of a message that has the power to save, not just spiritually, but existentially. And the minute we start bending that message to fit our feelings, we lose its power. We end up with religion as performance, worship as nostalgia, and faith as therapy. The truth is, the cross is hard. It hurts, but it heals. And if we're serious about becoming whole, about confronting evil, overcoming despair, redeeming our brokenness, then we have to keep Christ at the center. No substitutes, no sentimental detours, no sacred feminine archetype standing in for the pain we refuse to carry. And if that makes us uncomfortable, good, because that discomfort is the beginning of transformation. It means the truth is getting close. So here's the choice before us. In every generation, in every church, in every heart, do we worship the one who bore the cross, or do we worship the image that makes us feel safe from it? Let's think seriously, because if we're going to talk about the Pope, about Mary, about worship, then we're not just talking about theology. We're talking about symbolic structures, psychological architecture, what we aim our attention at, what we revere, ultimately shapes our behavior, our societies, and our souls. Human beings are creatures of worship, whether they like it or not. The only real question is what or whom they worship. And if that object of worship is misaligned, distorted, or falsely elevated, the consequences reverberate far beyond the religious realm. They infect everything. Now, one of the great dangers, maybe the danger, of religious confusion is the false elevation of intermediaries. And this goes to the heart of this current issue with the Pope and Mary. When the church begins to blur the distinction between reverence and worship, especially in its leadership, especially from the top, it risks redirecting the flow of spiritual energy. That's not harmless, that's catastrophic. Because worship is not just admiration. Worship is surrender. It's sacrifice. It's the willing submission of the self to what is perceived as the highest possible good. That's what makes it powerful. And that's also what makes it dangerous when it's misapplied. If you start aiming that kind of devotion at anything less than God Himself, anything finite, anything human, even a figure as holy and virtuous as Mary, you're setting people up for spiritual confusion. And spiritual confusion is no minor thing. It doesn't just make people naive, it makes them vulnerable. Vulnerable to exploitation, to dependency, to manipulation disguised as doctrine. You see this all the time in authoritarian systems. And I use that word deliberately because religious authoritarianism hides behind virtue. It says we are merely guiding the flock. But what it often means is we are shaping how they think. And when the leaders of an institution begin to endorse the elevation of someone like Mary to a position that edges close to divinity, when they start inviting people to pray to her instead of through Christ, that's not just theological sloppiness, that's institutional overreach. That's the church acting like it owns salvation rather than serving it. And here's the psychological kicker. Once you tell people they need an intermediary besides Christ to access grace, you've inserted dependency into the sacred. You've created a system where people no longer believe they can come to God directly. They start believing they need a mediator to mediate the mediator, that they can't be heard unless someone else, someone gentler, someone more like them pleads for them. And that introduces a subtle but corrosive lie into the heart of faith that Christ is not enough, that the sacrifice was not sufficient, that your prayers require a second voice because the first one might not be welcome. That's not humility, that's spiritual insecurity. And when that insecurity is cultivated by leaders, it becomes weaponized. It keeps people small. It makes them more likely to obey, but not more likely to grow. And isn't that exactly what the narcissist does? Tells you you're not enough on your own. Tells you you need them to be safe, to be loved, to be acceptable. That's not godliness, that's control. Now, the church is supposed to be a bastion of truth, a place where clarity is sacred, and when it plays with the language of worship, when it subtly shifts focus from Christ to Mary under the guise of tradition or beauty or reverence, it stops being a lighthouse and starts being a fog machine. It doesn't illuminate, it obscures. And the people inside that fog don't even realize they're lost until it's too late. You have to ask, why is this happening now? Why is this elevation of Mary intensifying in our modern era? And the answer is not theological, it's psychological. It's cultural. We live in a time of unprecedented chaos, gender confusion, broken families, moral relativism, fatherlessness. And in that vacuum, the longing for the maternal rises. People want the mother, the protector, the nurturer, the one who says you are safe without demanding anything in return. And so Mary becomes the vessel for that collective yearning. That's understandable, but it's also deeply dangerous. Because when you inflate a symbol beyond its rightful place, you corrupt the system it belongs to. You break its balance. Mary was never meant to replace the Father. She was never meant to soften the Son. Her role was to point to them, not eclipse them. And when the Pope or any spiritual authority leans too heavily into Marian devotion at the cost of Christ-centered clarity, he's not just misguiding the church, he's tapping into a cultural regression. He's feeding the psychological need for comfort over courage, and that does not lead to strength. It leads to infantilization. What's needed now, more than ever, is mature faith. A faith that confronts the tragedy of life head-on, that recognizes the centrality of the cross, not as a comforting symbol, but as a terrifying and redemptive truth. A faith that calls people not to cling to intermediaries, but to stand upright, speak directly, and walk boldly toward the God who already tore the veil in two. Because that's what real worship demands. Not sentiment, but sacrifice. Not helpless dependency, but courageous communion. Not another layer between us and God, but the brave acceptance that, through Christ, the way is already open.